Hello everyone and welcome to the Dyslexia Life Hacks Show. I'm your host Matthew Head, and in this episode I'm talking to Matt Hancock MP. He's the MP for West Suffolk and has formed my health secretary between 2018 and 2021. His political career really got into gear when he got elected to Parliament in 2010. He was then a backbencher but worked through the ranks of the Conservative government. Before that he was an economist. He's also a dyslexia advocate and has linked to the Accessible Learning Foundation, ALF or ALF. As always, I'll put links to Matt, Alf, and anything we talk about in the show notes, which will be available at dyslexialifehacks.com/podcast. Welcome to the show, Matt.
It's great to be with you.
Excellent. So, when I wanted to start this podcast off is I was skimming through your profile and realised you trained to be a jockey in 2012.
I did, yeah.
Why?
Because I represent Newmarket in Parliament.
Of course. Yeah.
And thousands of my constituents are part of the racing industry, if you like.
Yeah.
You know, jockeys and trainers and grooms and vets and saddlers and all the rest of the things that are needed to put the horse racing industry together. And I've ridden horses in the past, but never been on a racehorse. And I'll tell you what happened was the British Racing School is in my constituency, where they train jockeys. So they take kids typically age 16, 17, 18, often kids who have struggled at school. So there is actually a dyslexia link as well. And they train them to be jockeys and to be stable staff. And then they go on and some of the most well-known and senior jockeys in the country have started out at the British Racing School. So they invited me as the new MP in 2011. And they said, do you want to go on the fake horse, on the equisizer, as they call it? And I said, sure, but I want to go on a real horse. So they put me on this retired racehorse.
Yeah.
And they sent me down their gallops, their track. And as I was starting, they were saying, hold. And I was trying to hold on to this horse. It was a, lively racehorse. And a van came around the corner and it had a TV crew hanging out the window. They'd invited the local BBC. And I just thought, just don't fall off. Just get to the end of it. Anyway, that was National Apprenticeship Week. And it went on the local TV. And the racecourse phoned me up and said, in the summer, we're doing a charity race. Will you come and ride in the charity race? And so I got trained. Frankie Dettori taught me how to ride a race.
Oh, cool.
And John Gosden trained a horse, got hold of a horse, and I learned how to ride a race, and then I won. It was absolutely brilliant. It was dreamy.
It's a thing to do in your 30s. How did you find sort of learning it? Because obviously you're dyslexic yourself, and we'll ask about that a little bit more. But was there any point in your life that you used some of the strategies you'd learned earlier on with your dyslexia to speed up your learning?
Oh, it was, the thing about it was that no matter how uncomfortable I felt, and you do feel uncomfortable the first time you ride on a racehorse because they're very lively, it is just a matter of plugging away and sticking with it, really. Yeah, I remember the first time that I went out, and they put me on a racehorse, and I went out with maybe 30 or 40 other horses around the ring where they warm up. You warm up in a walk and then go into a trot and then go out onto the gallops and shoot up the hill. And this horse tried to throw me off. It spun round and round and round. And I just clung on. And after that, the stable staff who do this for a living had a kind of respect because this horse had really tried quite hard to throw me off, and I very nearly had fallen off, but I just clung on, and that sort of started a rapport. And people come from all over the country, all over the world to work in Newmarket on the horses, and as I say, it's often people for whom straight line normal schooling hasn't worked out, and they have an affinity for horses, and the horses are highly intelligent. And making that connection and those sort of lateral connections that often you find dyslexic people have, are better at. A lot of them have that and can sort of communicate with these horses in a way that is far beyond any normal person like me and dare I say it, probably you. Because horses are extraordinary beings because they're hyper intelligent and they're hypersensitive. And when you get it right, you come together with the horse as one sort of unit.
Okay,
and and when it clicks, it is amazing. I actually then raced in another horse race a few years later, and it didn't really click. And I ended up basically running out of steam, and I was knackered and the horse was knackered. We got overtaken with, like 100 yards to go. And I remember then the sense of how, the horse and rider were, because I was knackered and wobbling all over the place. But when you've got the rhythm and there is this sort of natural rhythm to it, then there is this affinity that is very, very, very powerful. And these people go through from teenage years and just have it. And it's so beautiful to watch a great horse and a great rider together.
Yeah, cool. So what I want to do now, rather than talking about horses all day.
I didn't expect to do that. But
horses are far too dangerous for me. That's why I ride motorcycles. But what I want to find out really is, when in your life did you find out about dyslexia and your journey with dyslexia started?
Yeah. So I went through school thinking that I was just rubbish at languages, including English, but also all languages. And I was lucky because I'm okay at maths.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's lots of downsides to the English education system, but the advantage of A-levels being quite targeted is I could ditch anything that required more than a sentence.
Yes. Yeah.
So I did maths and physics and computing at A-level, and that allowed me to get to Oxford. But the number of people who come up to me and say, I felt I was stupid, or people just said I was lazy. And this is the importance of identification, right? Because then it's not just about getting the support you need, it's about your own view of yourself. I thought I was rubbish at languages. And I went to Oxford, but I'd applied to do politics, philosophy, and economics, which is essentially an essay-based subject.
Yeah, I can see the problem here.
Yeah, and why didn't I think of this? I'd done maths, physics, computing, and economics at A-level. So I'd done the economics, which is quite mathsy, and it was essentially essay based. And I got to the end of the first term, and I'd got in because in those days you didn't need to do an exam to get into Oxford.
Did you not?
You could do it. You could elect to do it only by interview. I had to do my A-levels, but there wasn't a specific exam. And I knew that if I did an exam for Oxford, I would not get in.
Yeah.
So I did the interview, and, I can talk the talk, and I've always been able to from a young age. And so I got in on my interview, and then they got, at the end of the first term, I remember it so clearly, my tutor, a wonderful man called Michael Hart, he said, he called me in at the end of term and he said, look, in our discussions, you're perfectly up to this, but your writing is terrible. And I'd also struggled because I couldn't read very quickly. So I'd had to read like the summaries of books rather than books. And he said, I think you're dyslexic. And he sent me off to the Oxford University's education department, where they had psych assessment. They confirmed that I was dyslexic. The gap between my written work and my oral language capability was off the charts. And then they gave me support and taught me how to read and write.
Okay. So what sort of support was there back then?
Well, I was taught to recognize words as pictures.
Yes.
And then to memorize the sound of the picture. So I read in pictures. And this is a fix that has worked for my life. Now, I suppose these days you might be taught that through phonics and taught the phonic subsections of words, but I was taught it in terms of recognizing whole words. There's one major downside to this, which is when I come across a new word or a new name, it takes me forever because I have to basically memorize it.
Yes,
I have to get that into my head.
Yeah.
But it worked for me, and it worked well enough for me to then be able to write essays and get through it. But it's dogged me all my career. I mean, I've had some major screw ups. I went and worked for this. I went for work for a wonderful man who was the MP for Guildford, and he asked me to help him out in the 2001 election campaign, and I went and did that. And he'd written this long election address that needed to be sent to every household, and when you're standing to be the MP, you get you can send one letter to every voter. That's part of the deal.
Yeah,
Royal Mail do it for free. And he'd written this long thing, and I was publishing it. And this was before you had spell checker. And he had this lovely phrase, "I want to unite the community."
Yeah.
And so I thought you can see where this is going.
Yeah, I can see this.
I pulled out this phrase and wrote it in large letters across the top of this leaflet.
Oh, so you're not doing it by half now?
No, and then we printed 40,000 of them.
Is that all?
Yeah, 42,000, I think. And then we sent them by Royal Mail to every household in the constituency.
Yeah.
And it was only when they landed from the Royal Mail that we opened it up, and in huge letters across the top of this, it said, "I want to untie the community." I mean, it was what a disaster.
I can imagine.
Yeah, really awful. So I've had moments like that throughout my career.
Yeah. So in that case, obviously you've sort of orchestrated it, so to speak, but isn't there other people around you that might, like you'd expect at some point, like my job as an engineer, so we have sort of various stage gates that stuff gets through before it gets out in the world.
Of course, so I've learned from that. So spell checker has been absolutely brilliant for me. In fact, I once got the chance to meet the guy who did spell checker.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and say thank you for saving my
saving our lives.
Yeah. And but now, for instance, I don't put out anything directly on social media. I have a WhatsApp group with my team. And if I want to write something, I write it down and then we check it. Because the problem with spell check is obviously things like untie and unite both come through spell checker. So it can't solve every problem. So I have a team which includes both dyslexic and non-dyslexics that look at everything, and then somebody else actually does the posting. And I do that to protect myself from making stupid mistakes.
Yeah, definitely.
Or indeed saying stupid things.
Yes.
Although they can't protect me entirely from that.
Yes. So obviously you had that with the memorising words at Oxford. Was there anything else they put in place? Because you would have got Oxford University obviously is fairly predigious. So I imagine they had a reasonably decent neurodiversity support team at the time, or...
Well, it wasn't called that. It was the ed psych department, and it felt quite piecemeal. It wasn't like there was a program like there might be now for neurodiverse students. I was sent to a building to knock on a door where there was a woman who said, "Oh, you're here for the test," and then gave me some. I think I went once a week for a term or so. It was more like that. The Oxford system is very one-on-one with the students. It's one of the amazing benefits and privileges of being there is that you get one-on-one time with the professors. But there definitely wasn't a program like I should hope there is now.
Yeah. And did it sort of snap things into place? You're saying as a child would I feel silly and stuff. That's a fair way through your education. I've not got that experience. I got picked up at 6, which...
Right. But that's far better. That's what we want for everybody.
Well, yes.
But we'll come to that. But the light bulb moment was very profound.
Yeah.
It changed the way I thought about myself. And I then came to love language. So I'd really struggled, for instance, with poetry, right? And at school, I read, right. But once I realized that the problem wasn't the language, it was the decoding of the written word. And then I basically got a fix for that, for most of the written word. Suddenly, I came to realize that I love language. And I've always loved the use of language with my voice.
Yes.
I just find it harder to write it down.
Yeah.
And I still read very slowly.
Yeah, I remember that. engineering degree, STEM subject, you don't have to write as bigger essays anyway.
Yeah.
But I remember way back in college, navigating through the elective modules, I can talk this one.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's funny, isn't it? But sometimes dyslexic people tend to almost be really, really good at verbal communication because the written one just isn't there, which sounds like the same in your case.
Exactly. And, really, dyslexia, the simplest identifier of dyslexia is the gap between your oral language ability and your written language ability. My gap's big.
Yes. Yeah, mine's... I've it used to be really, really big, but I've gone on various different training things and bits and pieces.
What's worked for you?
I did the Davis program, if you've ever heard of that one.
No, I haven't come across it.
Very similar thing. Gifted Dyslexia is the book on it. And did that. That really... I was listening to Gifted Dyslexia on audio because why would I read it?
Yeah.
And, wow, this is me. I need to book myself for the course. And it has made a big difference. But so what I want to do now is fast forward through your economics career into politics, because what I'm really curious is, in my mind, politics would be a mix of talking, which obviously is one of your strengths.
Yeah.
And imagine a lot of writing in the background.
Yeah.
So you decided to switch from being an economist into politics. But how did you start finding dyslexia when you become a politician? Was there certain things you were like, is it one of them jobs that actually, if anybody's listening wants to be a politician at some point, really works a dyslexic mind? Was something you really had to work at?
For me, it did. Because, the big moments in politics, the moments that you have an impact are generally when you're speaking. If we all think of the big moments in politics, they're when somebody has said something, comes onto our screens and says, or stands up in Parliament and says something. Now, obviously, you need to be able to write the speech beforehand and write newspaper articles. But I got myself to a position where I was good enough for that. But I don't think anybody, I would say that my written word is particularly eloquent, right? Like, there's some people who are amazing at the written word. I think of, Boris Johnson's articles, absolutely, it doesn't matter what you think about what he says, his ability with the written word is extraordinary. But also the other thing that worked for me in politics is that politics is about communicating with the people who you are there to serve. And so it isn't about long words and complicated language. It is about communicating in a way that can be easily understood. And in a way, this is one of the things I've done throughout my career. I did it as an economist at the Bank of England. I did it before that. I was in my family's computer tech company where I wrote the user manuals because I could understand the computer code, and then I wrote it in a way that is plain English. So translating complicated ideas into plain English is kind of one of my skill sets, and one of the things I've done in all sorts of different jobs. And then in the pandemic, I ended up, translating complicated scientific concepts into plain English, if you like. And that was one of my jobs at those press conferences. And and I think my dyslexia helped me with that because I don't like to write in long words because I find them more difficult to manage. And there's some people who bandy around, Latin phrases and all that. I can't do that. And so I'm more of a, so that makes me more straight talking, if you like. In politics, that's good. It's often things are overcomplicated, and successful communication requires simplification. Like for instance, on my current campaign, let's have early screening for every child in primary school. Right, that is quite a simple ask. That is what I want to see happen, So academia was definitely not for me because it's using language in at the other end of the spectrum, so to speak.
Yeah. I guess that is one of those sort of big picture thinking, which dyslexics tend to be quite good at, is seeing the big concept, as you say, whether it's during the pandemic or all the medical science that's being thrown at you that's constantly changing.
Yeah. And
then trying to simplify it.
Yeah.
So you can stand up at a press conference and talk to...
Well, that's right. So this applies even more in government because in government you have the experts who understand all of the long words, and they make a series of recommendations. The way it works is they make recommendations, like whether it's the civil servants or the medical experts, make recommendations, all of which they would be happy to support, for the person who is the democratic decision maker to say, okay, this is the one we're going to do. So, if you want something to happen, you say, I want this to happen, advise me on the best way to it. And they'll come up with different options of how to get there, and then you make the decision. But all of the different options presented are essentially rational. And the job is to see the big picture. Yes. When I first came out as dyslexic, when I got to the cabinet, Michael Heseltine texted me to say, well done on going public on that.
Yeah.
I found my dyslexia to be an enormous strength because I didn't get stuck in the weeds of details. I was always at the big picture level. And the funny thing was that I didn't have Michael's number in my phone. He'd not texted me before. And so I tried to save it. And do you know how to spell Heseltine? I haven't got a clue.
No? I didn't Google that one.
My dad's called Mike, and I find Michael quite difficult because which way around are the A and the E go? I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so I then had to text him back and ask him how he spelled his name so I could save it in my phone book. So from one dyslexic to another.
Yeah. See, when you get the surname Head, it's dead easy. It does make me thinking, and my experience in the cabinet room is obviously movies and watching The Crown. So feel free to tell me that my assumption is wrong. But there's a lot of people in there, a lot of talking, and I don't know about yourself, but my brain tends to switch off hearing to write notes and vice versa. So I find it quite tricky to keep up meetings if I'm making notes. You've also got a lot of people with a lot of ideas, dyslexics like yourself, and then orators like, say, Boris Johnson, who says a lot at points. How do you keep up with all that and make sure that you're keeping the right notes and you've got the information you want, so when the cabinet meeting finishes, you know what's going on going forwards?
Yeah, it comes down to capturing the essence.
Yeah.
Because, like you, detailed notes are not my thing, but the nice thing about being a minister, and certainly when you're in the cabinet, is you have people for that, right? So,
yes,
and yeah, I say that as a joke, but it's true, right? So, there are people whose job is to make sure that what is discussed in that meeting is recorded.
Yeah, of course.
And you just have to trust that happens well. And no doubt these days they can harness the power of AI to do that too. But my job was not, therefore, to make a detailed record of the meeting. My job is to work out what I'm going to say to impact and influence that meeting. So it comes back to oral communications, right? Decision-making in government is a lot of it. Of course, there's the piles of detailed paperwork, but then when the crunch comes, you sit around the cabinet table and you make a decision through discussion. In the same way, for instance, in the COBRA room, the emergency briefing room, where some of the most acute decisions are taken, they have screens on the walls where they write the action points as you're discussing them. So this is a really good decision-making technique when you've got a large number of people. So somebody's job is to sit at the computer, listening to the discussion, writing down the action points. They don't write the notes of, who said what. Somebody else does that, and they don't cloud the decision-making with that. But the action points are written up. So if I say, what I really need is for you to do this so that I can do that, because one of the main jobs of COBRA is to bring people from different departments together when you need a whole government response to something, right? So for instance, in COVID, I might say to the Transport Secretary, we need to take more action on the borders, or the Home Secretary on allowing people over the borders. And they may say, okay, I will do that. And then it gets typed up on this screen on the side of the meeting room, both sides, saying, Home Secretary to, do whatever she'd agreed to do. And then you can look up and read them and say, no, that isn't quite what we agreed. Or, no, we agreed somebody else would do that. And so you agree the action points from a crisis meeting as you're going through the meeting. And of course, those action points are written in really simple English. But the point is that, my job was not to do the notes. My job was to make an impact in the meeting to get to the right decision. And for that, again, it comes down to oral communication.
That sounds really cool. And actually, the simple bullet points, it's even a technique I employ at work, just bullet point on email. You're doing this, you're doing this.
Yeah.
To actually have a screen which is throwing up all over the place.
Yeah. Because then you get to the end of the meeting, everybody's, you're signed up to them, right? Because they're there in front of you.
So, of course, you're saying about the oral communication, you've got to be in a meeting, you want your point across. How do you prep for that? What's your particular technique for that? Because obviously you're not going to write prose and reload the textbook beforehand. Do you have other people that come in and write stuff to you? Do you get stuff? Do you get people to talk it through to you? Or how do you sort of absorb the information in the first place?
So I have learned to be able to read the script out. But when there's a new word in the script that I don't know, I have to learn it. So again, in the pandemic, when we found out that a drug called dexamethasone reduced your chances of dying if you end up in hospital with COVID by about a third, it took me about half an hour to learn the word dexamethasone.
Yes.
And JVT, wonderful man, the professor who was helping and led this scientific work with Sir Peter Horby at Oxford, he gave me half an hour of his time in order to learn the word dexamethasone. And it stuck, right? So now I know, and I broadly know how to spell it, close enough to get it to work in the spell check. And
yes.
and so I have learned how to read, that I can read out a script, but I just have to know the words in advance. But that isn't, I'm not very good at reading out a script. No. I'm far better when I'm saying it from the heart. So the way that I would write scripts is that somebody would do an initial draft. We'd have a discussion about what I wanted to say. Somebody would do an initial draft. And then again, we would put it up on a big screen and go through it line by line, typically with me pacing about, reading it out, editing it as we go. And so I would, and if we got to a bit where I thought it was going slightly in the wrong direction, I would then say what I wanted to say. And the speechwriter would capture that onto the screen to try to capture me talking as a normal person rather than the written script. Because, if you've listened to any number of speeches, and boy, I've listened to quite a few, the ones where it's somebody reading out language that is written for the written word are generally terrible. The speeches that work off a script are ones where it feels and sounds like a speech, even though they're reading off a script. And the best way to do that is to say what you want to say and somebody capture it and then write it down, because the written word is different in its nature to the spoken word. And so the best of all, of course, is just speaking off the cuff and answering the question. But sometimes you have to, those Downing Street scripts, we would agree in advance what was going to be said. And so you had to have a written script that I sent over to Downing Street for them to agree. So I couldn't just turn up and say, well, I'm just going to chat. That wasn't your government's too big for people to do that on a regular basis.
It's a similar thing to what I do, actually. I tend to talk script out on presentations first. How do you get the information in your head? So when you are having to talk off the cuff, if it's a cabinet meeting, whatever, so you're not necessarily in a scripted environment, but you've got a complicated thing like a pandemic to deal with.
Yeah.
How do you sort of retain your head? Because I'm imagining by what you're telling me, you're not the sort of person who's got loads of notes and bits of paper around them like some other people.
No,
by the time you've read to that point, the conversation's moved too far.
Yeah, I am very, very lucky that I retain figures extremely well.
Hence the ex-economist.
Yeah, I mean, I am a dyslexic who made it to the cabinet, but I'm very, very lucky with my maths. And it's not maths as sort of to get me through my A-levels, but also math. I mean, I'm not a great mathematician. I couldn't have studied maths at university, but enough to get me through. And so what I tend to do is I will write notes of a structure, which might only be one word to trigger a thought or an argument, but you want to simplify that as much as possible anyway. Okay, so a structure, maybe a 3-part structure, a 4-part structure, only requires about 3 or 4 words to get the order of the argument. So you get the argument in your head, and anyway, you're far better making an argument if you understand the argument, internalize it, and then articulate it rather than read it out. But the thing I'm lucky at is that then, if you give me 2 or 3 stats that back up a particular argument, I'll be able to remember them. For instance, there's a statistic that only 1 in 5 children have their dyslexia identified at school. And I remember that stat from when I was first elected in 2010 and asked the Department for Education what the number was, and it was 1 in 5. When I left government, I asked them the same question, and I was astonished and appalled to find out it's still 1 in 5. But I was told last week that it's gone down to 18% from 1 in 5, which is 20%. Now, I don't know whether that's a rounding issue or whether that's an actual decline. Nevertheless, the fact that it's 18%, I've only read that once a week ago, and I haven't used that stat until you asked me for an example, and it's just stuck in my head. So I'm lucky. My numbers go into my brain like throwing a bit of Velcro at a those balls that you play with on the beach where you Velcro just Velcro dart. You just has to touch and it sticks. Words, they bounce off like sunlight on a mirror.
Yes. Hence why you had to spend half hour learning the
dexamethasone.
Yeah, that's it.
But he's in there now.
He's not. He's not. And if they change,
don't get me started on hydroxychloroquine.
Don't change the name of these drugs, people.
I still remember the moment that I found out that I was being asked to be health secretary by Theresa May when she was prime minister. I was the digital and culture secretary and absolutely loving it. Loving the cultural life, and tech is my background. Then I realized I was about to be asked to be health secretary. And the first thing that went through my, I was going to say brain, body, was a overriding sense of fear of the long words.
Of course, yes. Yeah.
Because medicine is full of long words.
Yeah, they do enjoy that. Yeah.
And I, I couldn't be a doctor because I couldn't do the long words.
What's wrong with you? It's broke.
Yeah. Leg. I can do leg.
Yeah.
And what I realized with the help of Chris Whitty, who was absolutely brilliant, was that, it's his job to do the long words. My job is to communicate that in a way that a lay person would understand. So I always thought about my dad, who is a perfectly intelligent but completely unmedically trained person who goes to the doctor as little as he possibly can, right? Is him I'm talking to.
Yes,
and so, but the physical, it was visceral, it was physical, it was, oh my God, I don't think I can do that job because I can't cope with the long words. And for any dyslexia will understand what that feels like, the fear of this, of the inability to get things on paper into your head.
It's a really interesting point. I don't know how you feel about this. Maybe you do when talking to Chris Whitty, but do you find sometimes you're in meetings with other people who can do all the words and stuff and like, wow, you almost start to feel intimidated.
Yes.
Like, hang on, no. I'm just the specialist in another area.
Yeah.
This is just a person who's able to do that better than I am.
100%. Intimidated is the right word. I have been intimidated by language, and then I've found ways to work around it.
Yeah. And I think it's good for people to hear that even somebody who's got the sort of height skill that you have, that sometimes that stuff is still kind of scary when you have to go into these meetings and learn all this stuff.
Yeah. It's.
So moving towards first of all, let's talk about the dyslexia bill. Been a key thrust recently. So when did the idea of putting a dyslexia bill through come into your mind? And for people who don't know what it is, what exactly is it?
So when I left government in 2021, I felt like the work on dyslexia was unfinished business. Actually, before the pandemic, I'd put a team together to try to drive improved support for dyslexic people from the health department when I was health secretary. And it hadn't, unfortunately, it had only just got going and then had to be disbanded so the people could go and work on the pandemic.
Makes sense.
And so for me, this was unfinished business. And as a backbencher, you can't you pull the levers in government. But what you can do is make the case and change the law. They're basically the two things you can do as a backbench MP. So I tried to do both. And I was lucky that I got given what's called a private member's bill. 10 MPs a year are given the chance to change the law from a bill that's, which is, that's how a law starts as a bill and then becomes an act when Parliament passes it, Act of Parliament. 10 MPs a year are given the chance to start their own bill, right? The government starts all the other bills and then MPs can amend them, but 10 are given the chance to start their own bill, and it is random. And I won the ballot. And I was number 2 out of the 10, so I had the chance to introduce a bill. And I could introduce it on anything. And when you do well in this ballot, you get inundated by people saying, please can you, the Red Squirrels of the UK Association immediately gets in touch, saying, can you protect the red squirrels? And hundreds of interesting areas. I am, in fact, the parliamentary spokesman and protector of the dormouse, which is because it's a protected rare breed. But I didn't do anything on dormice or squirrels or anything else. No. I chose dyslexia.
Yeah.
You then work with the clerks to write your bill. The dyslexia screening and teacher training bill, because for me, with my experience and having heard all of these stories about late diagnosis, I want every child to have dyslexia identified in primary school and at a young age so they can get the support early. And the half of this is already in place, which is the phonics check now at the end of year 1. Now, lots of people who are dyslexic absolutely fear the phonics check because it is used as a proxy for how good you are at language, but it isn't. It's how good are you at written language. And what they need is an oral test at the same time as the written test. And then dyslexic children are likely to be those who do well at the oral language and poorly at the written language phonics test. And then if that gap is identified, you can support them. Because if you're not very good at phonics and not very good at oral language, then you need different support because there your language skills are poor. That isn't dyslexia. Yes. Dyslexia is when you have good language skills, but you can't get it down on paper. Yes. So that's what I've been campaigning for. And I pushed to change the law and introduce teacher training for neurodiversity as a whole. And what the government did is they said, okay, we're not going to back your bill, but what we are going to do is change policy by introducing neurodiversity training into teacher training and do more on early identification of all neurodiversity. And they've done pilots on the latter, and that's great, but not enough. It needs to be universal. And on teacher training, they have introduced neurodiversity training into teacher training. But again, it's not enough because every teacher teaches dyslexic kids. Every teacher teaches children with all different neurodiversities, and they need to understand how different brains work differently better than they do now. So I still regard this as unfinished business. And yesterday, I got the chance once more to reintroduce my bill. So I got a phone call from the clerks in the House of Commons saying, if you come to this particular place at 10 a.m. On Thursday, you will be given a slot because the slot had become free. This isn't this sort of ballot process I was talking about. The slot's become free. You can have the slot. 23rd of April is the slot. But if you turn up in person, I was supposed to be going to the UN to Paris to talk to the UN about neurodiversity. They had a big shindig yesterday. I cancelled the trip and went and got the bill slot. And I'm going to update the bill slightly to make it targeted at where the government needs to go from now, because they have made some progress. Then I'm going to introduce that on St. George's Day. So it's exciting because that's news. And for me, this is the last shot. I'm going to leave Parliament at the next election, which is going to be in the autumn. And so I've got one more shot to make this case in Parliament.
So what's the timeline looking at for that? Obviously, you've mentioned St. George's Day.
So St. George's Day, I'll introduce it, and I'll then get another date for the next stage because there's a whole sort of parliamentary passage honest truth is that timings are tight to get that through before the election. And if any bill isn't concluded as an election, then they fall.
Okay. Does that not matter whichever party?
Whichever party. So you have to start the whole thing up again in the new parliament. And I hope that there'll be advocates in the new parliament to do this. But because I'm leaving, I wanted to set up a permanent campaigning organisation on this. Hence, I founded ALF, the Accessible Learning Foundation. Can we please just call it ALF, because accessible is just an impossible word. And I apologise and it is an irony, I've started a dyslexia charity that with an almost impossible to spell name.
Well, it's up there with dyslexia.
Yeah, exactly. I know dyslexia has a sort of theme of impossible words.
On to ALF, which makes me think of that 70s cartoon.
Good. But you see, you've got a pictorial relationship with the word, and then it'll be easier to remember.
I do, and actually the thing comes to mind is the logo.
The logo?
Yeah.
What?
With the nose as the L and all that kind of stuff. So the logo does stick in my mind for that. So
yeah.
So let's talk more about...
The logo is available on the Dyslexia Life Hacks website.
Yeah. Send it across. So tell me more about that. So that's obviously... I understand now that you can push the bill through Parliament. The theatre of doing it on St. George's Day is quite good fun. Please wear white and red.
Maybe a red tie instead of my normal pink. Yeah.
And
or a yellow ALF tie, because we have the yellow branding. Anyway, so I founded this. I founded ALF because I want there to be a charity in this space whose unambiguous focus is on getting early identification in schools and in prisons. Because, of course, if this goes well, if the teaching goes well, if people get the support they need, you can end up doing anything, right? You can end up running some of the biggest businesses in the world as a successful entrepreneur. You can end up in the cabinet like I did, but we can't be Panglossian. That isn't what happens for everybody. And if you don't get the support that you need, too often you end up in prison. And we know that around half of people in prison have a neurodivergent condition, and the average reading age of a prisoner in the UK prison is 11. 52% have a reading age of primary school reading age. So ALF is focused on early identification in schools, both keeping the campaign going and the voice, but also direct support for schools to put in place the what's needed, because most of this is now available through technology. Not the actual diagnosis, but the identification and screening to know who has got a problem, and specifically what each individual child's particular challenge is, and for all neurodivergent conditions, not just dyslexia, because there's so much overlap. And the same early identification challenge that is there with dyslexia is there with ADHD, autism, and dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and the rest. So it's that. There you go. So we founded ALF. We're going to fundraise to make that happen, and we're here at the Dyslexia Show, and it's a vehicle for making the argument. Now, there's one thing I'm really careful about, which is that there are loads of good charities in this space. There are loads of good charities. So our specific USP is the early identification and using voice, and the fact that we can, I'm fortunate to have access to very large numbers of people, for instance, through my social media, and so giving voice. So we want to work with everybody else in this space to keep making the case. Because I was a little bit skeptical of my own idea, which of having the charity, which is, well, hold on, there are loads of people doing good work in this space. So we sat back and we really tried to be tough on ourselves. What is the value that we can add? And I think that's it.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. So the first thing comes to mind, really, if your bill goes through Parliament before the election, what is ALF's purpose then? Because you would have almost... I know there's more to come.
To make it happen.
Yeah.
There's loads of laws that don't actually happen.
Of course. Sorry, too idealistic over
Yeah. So to make it happen, and there's also the criminal justice aspect, which you can't really legislate for nearly as easily.
Yeah, smashing it is pretty tricky.
And so delivery in schools, and then support in prisons, and especially in young offenders institutes.
Mm. Is it your plan once you've sort of stood down from the backbench later on this year that you're going to focus on how full time? Is that you're really going to push it at that point?
I'm going to keep pushing it. And basically this is the thing I'm going to add my voice to. This is the only this is the only part of the national debate that I'm going to keep going on. This is my philanthropic. This is my philanthropic.
It's nice to be tightly focused on that as well.
Yeah. Prison
thing's really interesting, isn't it? And the stats you said, which you can probably tell I'm not that great at remembering them, unlike yourself. The stat you said that is ridiculously high. So are you going to start building programs that go into prisons to help the neurodiverse community?
Yes, we're talking to some people about doing programs in prisons. There's policy change that's needed there as well. For instance, I'd like to see the assessment that prisoners do on the way in repeated on the way out, so that prison governors can be held accountable for the improvements or otherwise of literacy levels, whilst there is literally a captive audience. And we're talking to the Lord Chancellor about that. He's receptive, but there's other masses of other pressures in our prisons as well. We've already had one campaigning success. It was before Alpha was founded, really, but something that I pushed for hard in Parliament, which was that for the data to flow following the prisoner around the system, because too often prisoners in the past would have an assessment on the way in, and then they'd be moved to prison quite early on, from a reception prison to your prison where you're going to spend most of your sentence, and the data wouldn't follow, so they'd end up at a lower category prison, or the prison where they were going to spend their time, and then be asked to repeat the assessment, which obviously doesn't go down particularly well. The assessments themselves were poor and have been improved. So there's a whole load of work that's needed. But the latest thing, the next step, is to try to get accountability for prison governors so that they care about literacy. They have introduced a neurodiversity manager into every prison in the country now. But it's not enough just to have the manager, good as they are. They need to be gripping the system, because without dealing with this, I can't see how we can ever get reoffending down.
Yes. No, yeah, definitely. And I think it's, I know from my life, and I'm sure you know from yours, like getting to grips with dyslexia does help sort of push you into places you never thought you'd be, and in a good way. So being able to get that with people who are already in the system and not to be back at it would be really, really great.
Yeah.
So as we come to the close of the podcast, each guest gets 3 rapid-fire questions from myself. They don't need rapid-fire answers for you, but they're quick questions for me. I imagine you should be pretty good at this, considering what you've done as a job for quite a few years. So, rapid-fire question number 1. What prejudice about dyslexia have you had that has been proven wrong?
Ridicule. So, when I think in my 20s, 20 years ago, my dyslexia was invited ridicule from people. And now when I talk about it, I don't get that at all. We're not there yet. There was an article in the Times last week saying they didn't think that ADHD existed at all. I mean, so there are people, that wasn't specifically on dyslexia, but it was about neurodiversity. So, this battle will never be fully won. We've got to, there's a long way still to go. And, but I think that there you go. Ridicule.
Cool. Okay. Second question in this rapid fire set. If an alien landed and you had to describe dyslexia to them, how would you do it?
Oh, it's a gap between your ability to read and write on paper and the gift of the gab.
Yes. That's a simple way of putting it. And of course, the last rapid fire question is set. And seeing as this is the Dyslexia Life Hack show, what is your favorite dyslexia life hack?
Oh, my favorite dyslexia life hack. I mean, I'm tempted to say spell check, but as my own screw-ups demonstrate,
yes,
it isn't enough on its own. I think learning words as pictures.
Yeah.
Learning words as pictures.
Yeah, definitely. How do you find, out of curiosity, how do you find words that, like the filler words, the these and the ands? How do you work with them, or you just have to kind of ride over the top of them a bit?
Yeah, well, they're just there, aren't they? And I know them pretty well now.
Fair enough. Okay, well, before we sign off, is there anything else you'd like to add, and where can people find you and Alf?
Yeah, so you can find Alf at Accessible Learning Foundation .org, or it's actually better to Google Alf. That's where you can find Alf. I would just say to anybody who's got through to listen all the way to the end here, keep up the fight and let's keep the voice out there. We've got to keep making the argument. We can't be complacent and think that, people understand. It takes empathy to understand what it's like to have a neurodiverse brain. And it is our job to keep explaining it. And so I would just encourage everybody to share and to talk about it. And I found talking about my dyslexia to be incredibly rewarding and empowering. And this is a community. Let's support each other. So share this podcast.
Yes, definitely. Well, that leaves me, dear. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day at the Dyslexia Show and huddle up in this back room with me to talk about everything. It's been great and really interesting to hear how you cope with bits and pieces, particularly when you're in government.
Terrific. Thank you.
And I want to thank everybody else for taking the time to listen, and I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye for now.